loved hearing family history, family stories, looking at old family photographs. My great aunt Mag, for example, had wonderful photographs of going way back. Amongst that group of older relatives was my adopted Aunt Esther, and Aunt Esther was a black Londoner, a working class Londoner born before the First World War. She was born in 1912. So you can imagine hearing her life story. It was quite unusual because the history of black people in Britain had not been properly documented. It wasn't mentioned in school. In school we may have heard of the slave trade, and that was about it. So as I'm growing up and hearing all these stories, and in particular Aunt Esther's story, I'm also conscious in the 1970s, which is when this was happening, the sort of formative years for me, the National Front, the rise in popularity of the fascist National Front was going on, and there were National Front marches along Peckham Road, and outside my bedroom window I witnessed all of that. And so I'm kind of thinking, this is objectionable, it's wrong, and I started to question the whole notion of black people in Britain.
One of your first books was about Aunt Esther,
The
and
very first.
she had a fascinating history. Her father came over, was it from the Caribbean?
Yeah, what happened was that also in the 80s, alongside all the journals I wrote for, there was a growing momentum, if you like, of local publishers publishing local people's stories. And that's how Aunt Esther's biography, if you like, came about in 1991. In Fulham, in West London, they had a local publishing venture that commissioned the book straight away when I went to them. And so, yes, I was able then to put into the public domain Aunt Esther's life story, and it started very much with her father, who was a very early black settler who came here to London around sort of 1910, 1911, in the Edwardian era, and was on the ships. He was a seaman, a merchant seaman, and he stayed here and never went back to British Guyana, which was the country he originated from. He married a Cockney, a white lady from the East End, and Esther was born shortly afterwards.
Her father, had been in a few films, hadn't he?
Yes, what happened in the 1930s mainly was that Paul Robeson, who was probably the most famous black man in Britain at that time, was making films in this country. He was a very famous American singer and actor, and so that provided a lot of extra work as extras on those films. And Joseph, who was Esther's father, along with hundreds of other black men in Britain, African students who were studying here, working class black labourers like Joseph, would go to the film studios in Shepperton or wherever it was, and be what they called spear carriers in these films, which were mostly based in Africa anyway, because Paul Robeson's films kind of had those themes running through them. But there was always work to be had in the film studios.
So Aunt Esther had been with her father. How did she come to be a part of your family?
1941, her father was killed in an accident during the Blitz, the London Blitz, during the war. And by then, you see, my family knew her anyway, because they all lived in the same street, and in Fulham. And my great-grandmother, Mrs. Johnson, Granny Johnson, was the mother figure, the matriarch in that community. She took care of everyone. And so when Esther's dad died, she said to Esther, come and live with me. She said, you're living on your own, you don't have any family. They'd known each other for years. They were going to the air raid shelter every night during the Blitz. And they became very close companions. But Esther was a lot younger than Granny. Granny was then probably in her 60s, maybe even 70s. Esther was a young woman in her 20s, so she wasn't a child who was adopted into my family, but she was adopted unofficially by Granny, and they stayed together for about 11 years. Granny died in 1952. So by the time my sister and I are born, Esther has become part of my family. Elizabeth Welch is an interesting case because when I was a child, Aunt Esther told me, and my mum told me, that Esther used to make dresses for her before the war, because Aunt Esther's job was as a seamstress. And then Elizabeth Welch would sing on the radio, and my mum would say, "Oh, that's Elizabeth Welch. Aunt Esther used to make dresses for her." So that kind of planted the seed in my head. Roll on many, many years, 1982, I had the joy of going to one of her concerts, because she was like Paul Robeson, an African-American expatriate settled in London in 1933, but never went back. She stayed here and had this long, very successful career on the London stage, in films, on television, on radio. And I met her at a time when she was just about starting this sort of renaissance in her career, because Derek Jarman had put her into a film of Shakespeare's The Tempest, and she sang her theme song, Stormy Weather. And then in the wake of that, she did a series of one-woman shows at the Riverside Studios, and I went along and saw her for the first time, met her backstage, and then later on that year went to see her at her home in London, and we got on like a house on fire, and we became great friends, and again, that was a friendship that lasted until she passed away. I mean, she actually lived to be 99. When the war broke out, Aunt Esther was conscripted to do war work, so she had to give up that job as a seamstress, so she lost contact with Elizabeth Welch. They weren't friends, but Aunt Esther would deliver the dresses to her house. Elizabeth remembered her 40 years later as the friendly coloured lady with the Cockney accent, which was quite funny. And then I always wanted to try and engineer a meeting of the two, but it never came about. But I did ask, when Esther turned 80 in 1992, I got Elizabeth Welch to sign a photograph to her, which Esther was thrilled with. It was the same relationship, to be honest, that I had with everyone in my family. The Fulham people are like Cockneys. They're not East Enders. They're not from the East End of London. They're from West London. But there's this working class community in Fulham who are very much like what I call the Cockneys. They're great sense of humour, very down to earth, very direct. They don't suffer fools gladly, don't mess around with them, but if they take to you, they take you to their hearts. And that's how the older people in my family, men and women, they were like that, and Esther was very much like that. So I had the same kind of relationship with her, really, that I had with my grandmother and my great aunts, and it was really a lot of laughs, a lot of time.
And what did Aunt Esther identify as? Did she see herself as British or Afro-Caribbean or Black British?
No, she saw herself as British. Her father instilled in her a sense of pride in being a woman of colour, so to speak. And she was very much, her identity was as a Black British woman, although sadly at the end of her life she did admit to me that she didn't feel British anymore, and that she started telling people, when they asked her what she would say, "I'm from Guyana."
Why was that?
During the sort of Thatcher years, she hated Thatcher, and then John Major. She felt that elderly people were being pushed out of society and marginalised. She felt that was happening to black people as well, and she became quite, in a way, ashamed of this country and how it had turned out. You've got to remember, Thatcher was Prime Minister for a very long time, and for an older person in this country who was not a Tory, should we say, who was a Labour supporter, which she was, she became very disillusioned. And also as an elderly person she became disillusioned because she didn't feel enough was being done for older people.